food delivery is rideshare adjacent. It's not one to one, but I do draw on their examples to try to figure out what would the economics be of increasing wages in a way that doesn't make sense. There's some ways to do it that I think makes sense, like New York City. There's some ways where it kind of doesn't make sense. I'm not going to say Seattle doesn't make sense, but here's a story that details what Seattle is currently facing after increasing their wages in January. So it says Seattle law mandating higher driver pay is a disaster. Just 2 weeks after the law went into effect, Seattleites had to contend with $26 coffees and $32 sandwiches. So this seems to be more in the perspective of the orderer. In 2022, Seattle's city council passed an ordinance mandating a minimum earnings floor for app-based food delivery drivers in the city. The law finally went into effect in January 2024, but so far the main result has been customers deleting their delivery apps en masse, food orders plummeting, and driver pay cratering. Yes, cratering. I thought I was going to say catering. The ordinance, part of a legislative package called Pay Up, was passed under the banner of protective gig workers, right? I assume they passed it in order to favor gig workers, right? Even if it's not working the way it was supposed to work, that doesn't mean I think they were doing it to harm drivers. By setting up a compensation floor for app delivery drivers based on miles driven and amount of time worked, the ordinance operates as a supremely complicated minimum wage. And they have to do it that way because we're independent contractors. The wage floor is based on a labyrinth calculations. The engaged minutes for drivers are multiplied by a minimum wage equivalent rate, which is then multiplied again by an associated cost factor. That is kind of too much. And then multiplied again by an associated time factor. Next, the sum is added to the total of engaged miles of drivers, multiplied by the standard mileage rate, and then multiplied once more by the associated mileage factor. It says if you're lost, don't worry. The text of the ordinance itself literally does the math for you. I was getting stressed reading that. Herald a first of its kind legislative breakthrough when it passed, the first 2 months of ordinance operations had provided grim real-world economics 101 lesson. First, the delivery companies were forced to add a $5 fee onto delivery orders in the city to cover sudden labor cost increase. I want to talk about that for a second. The word I would use here is retaliation. And I have a lot of mixed feelings on this, right? I think that if a company can shoulder the burden of increased wages without increasing costs, they should do it, right? But not all companies can. And Sergio from the Rideshare Guy made a great point that if you can't, then that is a problematic business model, right? So I sit in the middle of that. I kind of agree, kind of disagree. I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about it. But I'm very pro laissez-faire economics. I believe that some government protections is important, but for the grand scheme of it all, I think the less government interferes, the better overall. That's not 100% true. That's just where I lean in my belief system. And in order for us to consider this retaliatory, even if we consider it immoral, it's not illegal, right? Businesses all the time, when forced to increase their minimum wage through various states, that has happened over the last couple of years, some of them shut down because they can't afford to stay open. Some of them increase prices in order to afford to stay open. So there's a level of legitimacy that has to happen when wages are forcefully increased. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. But to prove that it is immoral, we would have to prove that the company had no choice but to do it. But it's still not illegal. And then on top of that, I also sit in the middle of, should this be illegal? And it's kind of like that person runs a business, a cost for them has increased. I think it should be up to them to increase the number. Now, there's going to be real world effects of having that number increase, but I'm not a fan of figuring out how we can make government say, hey, you can't increase your prices just because we're increasing driver pay. That, to me, from what I feel from an American business model perspective, feels very anti-American business model, So I'm kind of let things live or die based off of company decisions, And I understand these companies are growing to be very big, but if you have to get in your car to go and get food, I think you'll be okay. If you don't want to pay the amount, vote with your wallet. So I think that a lot of the people who support these ordinance increases, when there's something negative that might happen because of it, I think that they're going to default to just blaming something outside of economics. But I've been maintaining the position that this is what happens, right? And rideshare is not one-to-one. this is food delivery. But even if a percentage of this happens to rideshare, we have to acknowledge that the potential for it to happen exists. Now, if you don't care, right? If you want wages to increase and you think it'll sort itself out, and that's fine. But I think it's short-sighted to think that there is no negative thing that will happen to drivers if we increase wages too hard too fast. Local news station King 5 reported that Seattle residents started deleting their delivery apps from their phones in response to the spiking exorbitant delivery prices. Uber Eats experienced a 30% decline in order volume in the entire city. So, drivers is one thing, right? You can make a law focused on drivers, but if you ignore the moving parts around the total sum, it can still be dangerous for the larger economy, right? You're talking about a 30% decline in orders. If you have a restaurant that was surviving because of, these food delivery apps, and they lost a third of their orders, a third of their income, not including whatever waste they might now have because they're not fulfilling the same amount of orders that they were before. Used to be a district manager for kitchen, so some of that plays around in my head. We're talking about a third. What would you do if you lost a third of your income? It would be pretty devastating, right? So it's not as simple as let's increase wages, drivers get paid more, people order less, restaurants don't have as much money now. Those restaurants are gonna have to start cutting hours, firing people, and then those people, and until they can get better work, are probably going to become rideshare drivers, food delivery workers, saturating the market, further exacerbating the issue. And I say this not because I want it to be the case. I say this because that's what has happened in various industries that are not even adjacent to rideshare. It's now happening in an industry that is adjacent to rideshare. And I think that it would be ignorant to assume it wouldn't happen at all in rideshare. I do think there are ways to implement these things that don't make it more tolerable, right? I'm not saying I'm against wage increases. I just think that doing it wrong hurts a lot. Uber Eats experienced a 30% decline in order volume in the city, while DoorDash reported 30,000 fewer orders within just the first 2 weeks of the ordinance taking effect. In turn, the decrease in demand directly impacted the pocketbooks of the delivery drivers themselves. A driver who made $931 in a week this time last year saw his earnings drop by half to $464.81 in a comparative week this year. Another reported consistently making $20 an hour prior to the ordinance, only to see his earnings likewise fall by more than half since its enactment. In other words, while the ordinance theoretically raises drivers' earnings to over $26 per hour, a number that ironically far exceeds Seattle's $19.97 standard minimum wage, drivers are barely logging any hours as a result of the drastic decrease in demand for food delivery. So, translation, they're making more money per active hour, but the amount of active hours they have been declining, which is exactly what I think, my opinion, will happen if this ordinance in Minnesota is passed the way it currently is. I think that it's going to massacre active time. Yeah, you'll make more money per active time, but the amount of active time you're going to be able to have while you're actually picking someone up in P2 and P3, it's going to get massacred. It's going to be a bloodbath for those of you who follow politics. Okay, as one Seattle driver summarized, it was dead. Demand was dead. A second driver put it more bluntly, I've got nothing. I'm not going to sit here for hours for one frickin' order. In addition to drivers, those who have been hardest hit include local mom and pop restaurants that have seen delivery orders dry up, and even the city's elderly and disabled population who often depend on affordable delivery options for meals. One might imagine that progressive politicians would be quick to repeal a law that hurts workers, non-corporate local businesses, and elderly and disabled all at the same time. But Seattle's government officials are busier doubling down or dissembling. I don't agree with that. I have it somewhere. Hold on a second. Okay, so this is the article that I found. I don't know where it disappeared to, but here's the title. It says Seattle may walk back wage hike for delivery drivers.